Hello. In this tutorial, I'm going to explain and then demonstrate how we can protect the Azure infrastructure against the well-known CVE 2021-44228, also known as the log.j or the log4shell. We can leverage the policies. We can leverage the IDPS functionality of Azure Firewall to block this vulnerability. And if we have the web application firewall, we could also ensure here that the signature sets are enabled to protect us against this vulnerability. In order to protect this on the Azure Firewall, the Azure Firewall SKU needs to be a premium SKU. And I'm going to demonstrate how we can migrate if we're on a standard version of Azure Firewall. How do we migrate it to the premium version? The overall migration process on a high level is split into two components: the migration of Azure Firewall policy and the migration of the Azure Firewall itself. These are two independent activities. The migration of Azure Firewall policy is non-intrusive. What happens during the migration of the Azure Firewall policy is Azure creates a new policy with a SKU type premium and copies all the rule sets from the existing standard policy into this new premium policy. So at the end of the policy migration, you'll see that you will have two policies, a standard policy and a premium policy. And at this time, the standard policy is still intact with the standard Azure Firewall. And once you have finished the policy migration, you can proceed with the firewall migration. And the firewall migration can be broken down into multiple steps. The step one for the firewall migration is the deallocation of the standard firewall. And the second step is the allocation of new firewall, which is the premium version. So we will deallocate the standard version and then allocate a premium version. This step of deallocation and allocation is intrusive. You have a complete outage during this time. And you will see that once the premium firewall comes up, it comes up with one public IP. So if your standard firewall had multiple public IPs, the additional public IPs are disassociated, and you won't see them associated once the migration happens. And you need to bind that additionally. So once you migrate it to the premium version, you have to make sure that you bind your additional public IPs to the premium firewall. And that's your step 3. And in the step 4 is you will replace your standard policy, which is binded to the premium firewall, with the premium policy. So replacing the standard policy with the premium policy. That's the last step. And I will show you what are the commands used here, what scripts are used. So as I mentioned before, the migration is a kind of on a high level 2-step. It's the migration of the policy. The migration of the policy is done using a PowerShell script, and it's the only way to do. There is no GUI support, and I will show you how we can migrate our existing policy using this particular PowerShell script. This PowerShell script, you can load it from your computer or from the Cloud Shell. And in this demonstration, I have already uploaded this PowerShell script on the Cloud Shell, and we will execute it later. The lower part shows the configuration scripts for deallocation of the firewall, which means you're going to dump those standard firewall and you're going to migrate towards the premium firewall. So this is going to just deallocate the standard firewall. And in this case, we are creating again the new premium firewall with the same name, and the parameters here are the firewall name, the resource group, the SKU, in this case is the premium, the resource group name, the VNet name, the firewall public IP. Here you see that it's just one public IP has been defined. Once the firewall is fully migrated, you can then add the remaining public IPs manually using the GUI. So these are the scripts already available in the Microsoft website. So that's the step. Once the firewall is migrated, you can add additional public IP addresses if you have, and then replace the standard policy with the premium policy. This means that once the firewall is migrated, it is still binded to the old standard policy. That policy has not been disassociated. We need to associate the new premium policy, and that will be done in this step. Once this is completed, we will see how to configure the IDPs for this well-known vulnerability for the Log4Shell, and we will also ensure that the WAF signatures are enabled. Now let's go to the portal and see what kind of setup I have here. So you see I have a firewall FW1, and looking at this, it's currently in the SKU standard. We will be migrating later on this firewall to premium. This firewall has primarily a public IP, that is FW1 PIP. In this demonstration, I have additionally other public IPs. If I go to this one, so I have two public IP addresses here. So FW1 PIP and FW1 PIP2. And we will see that after the migration of the firewall, this additional IP address will be disassociated and we have to reassociate it manually. And what else we see is that we have a policy, the firewall policy, pol1, it's pol, and I have it already on the other screen. That's my policy. The policy name is pol. The tier is standard. And at the moment, what I have is I have three different rules. I have a DNAT rule. I have a rule which is internal rule, network-based rule, And I have the third rule is the application-based rule. Looking at this RDP, I have from internet, anyone from internet can access this public IP, which is on the firewall primary interface, and that gets translated to this. So RDP can be done to a specific private IP address here inside. And then a network-based rule allowing internal communication from the 10 network to the 10 network, and the application rule allowing the internal network to communicate with google.com. We will check after the migration to premium whether all these rule sets are intact. Now to proceed with the migration, we need to start with the migration of the policy. As I mentioned before, the migration of the policy is non-intrusive. We won't be losing or disconnecting from our existing infrastructure. I'll go to the Cloud Shell and execute this PowerShell command. This PowerShell command is going to create is going to migrate this policy, which means it's going to create a new policy, which is a kind of replica of the existing standard policy, but in the SKU premium. And it is asking us the policy ID. The moment I execute this script, it is asking me for the policy ID. And the policy ID is nothing but the resource ID. So you can see the policy here and go to the properties section and copy the resource ID. The resource ID is the policy ID. So go here, paste, and then execute. This process is going to create a new policy in the tier premium. Let's see. As you see here, the policy is being migrated, which means it's creating a new policy. It's not migrating the existing standard policy itself. It's creating a new policy, as we saw here. And the name of this migrated policy or the new policy is Paul_premium. So it adds this suffix premium to the migrated policy. The policy has been migrated, which is in the sense of a duplicate policy has been created. And if we look at this policy now, if you look at this tier, policy tier, it's premium, right? And if we look at the other one, that was our standard one, right? So that's the one. And if you look at now the rules, it should have duplicated all those rule sets here. And these are the three rules I had: the RDP, internal, and the app rule. All my rules are migrated. If I open this, it should be pointing